I am reading this article from my blog, link in the description. Struggling to speak in tongues. Struggling to speak in tongues is not uncommon. There are factors that contribute to the struggle to speak in tongues. I am assuming that you are struggling to speak in tongues for the first time. I know there are believers who usually speak in tongues, but sometimes they struggle to get started. If you are struggling to speak in tongues for the first time, I will recommend you start by reading How to Receive the Baptism of the Holy Spirit. Once you know the requirements of speaking in tongues and how speaking in tongues works, you will be in a better position to overcome your struggle to speak in tongues. If you already have the baptism of the Holy Spirit, but you are struggling to speak in tongues, I will give you tips of how to overcome the struggle. The origin of the struggle to speak in tongues. The struggle to speak in tongues is always on our side. The Holy Spirit, who gives us the ability to speak in tongues, can never struggle. 1. Struggling to speak in tongues as a result of a failing relationship with the Holy Spirit. Speaking in tongues is a gift of the Holy Spirit. When the Spirit of God is taken out of the picture, only meaningless noise is left. Apostle Paul refers to it as becoming a resounding gong. For those who struggle to speak in tongues for the first time, it always comes down to their relationship with the Spirit of God. In human relationships, gifts are only exchanged after love is established in the relationship. Likewise, receiving and operating in the gift of the Holy Spirit only happens after a relationship with the Holy Spirit has been established. Since the utterance and the power behind speaking in tongues is given by the Holy Spirit, if the connection you have with Him is weak, you will struggle to speak in tongues. I explained how speaking in tongues works in a previous article. From the explanation, you will understand how a weak relationship with the Holy Spirit hinders the gift of speaking in tongues. 2. Pride. Speaking in tongues is an act done in humility. For someone to speak in tongues, he must meet a certain level of humility. Pride that makes people struggle to speak in tongues manifests when people set unrealistic expectations about speaking in tongues. There are people who perceive speaking in tongues as gibberish. Others don't want people to know that they speak in tongues. The truth is that unless you are willing to be shamed for speaking in tongues, you will struggle to speak in tongues. Jesus taught about this principle when he said that if someone is ashamed of him before men, Jesus will be ashamed of him before his Father in heaven. You will struggle to speak in tongues if you don't want to pay the price in form of being shamed and being called names. 3. Struggling to speak in tongues because of an attack from the enemy. The devil knows that speaking in tongues is powerful. As a result, he comes up with schemes to frustrate any effort to speak in tongues. For believers who are newly baptized, the devil will always try to plant seeds of doubt. For believers who have the gift of speaking in tongues, the devil will usually create situations that make it hard for them to pray. There are many schemes that the devil uses to discourage believers from speaking in tongues. Some of them are done in the spiritual realm, but in the physical, they appear as fatigue. Physical distractions too, like phone calls, knocks on the door, and contentions from people, are usually orchestrated by the devil to make believers struggle when praying in tongues. Overcoming the struggle to speak in tongues. Pray in understanding. If praying in tongues is a struggle, pray in understanding until when you get the flow to pray in tongues. Speaking in tongues takes a greater level of faith than praying in understanding. This will solve your struggle if it was caused by weak faith. By praying in understanding, you will build your faith to a level that can comfortably handle speaking in tongues. 2. Speaking in tongues with other believers. If you can't beat the struggle to speak in tongues on your own, do it with other believers. There is power when believers pray together. I have heard many believers acknowledge that speaking in tongues in a congregation is easier than doing it alone. That is true. When I was new to speaking in tongues, I used to struggle to pray in tongues on my own. but when I was in the company of other believers, it will be a lot easier. As I grew in the gift, the struggle ended. I do record sessions of speaking in tongues, which you can use to find motivation and overcome the struggle. 3. Speaking in tongues in a conducive environment. The environment we are in affects how we speak in tongues. If you struggle to speak in tongues in private, try it in church among other believers. If speaking in tongues during the day is hard, try it at night. We are different in many ways. Each one of us has preferences when it comes to the environment of speaking in tongues. I prefer speaking in tongues when everything around me is quiet. I have friends who prefer speaking in tongues when worship music is playing in the background. There are no hard rules when it comes to speaking in tongues. Set up your room to suit your preferences and help you speak in tongues without a struggle. Struggling to speak in tongues conclusion. Struggling to speak in tongues is common. The struggle varies from believer to believer. Some experience the struggle for a few minutes, others experience it for months. Once you know the origin of the struggle and follow the right steps to overcome the struggle, speaking in tongues will be easy. The golden rule when it comes to speaking in tongues is always to live a life that preserves the presence of the Holy Spirit. If the Holy Spirit is comfortable to operate in your life, speaking in tongues won't be a struggle. God bless you.